In the heart of a tense courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Officer Johnson, a cop known for his racist tendencies, was ready to cross a line he couldn't come back from. It was a day like any other, until he encountered the woman who would change his fate forever. He thought she was just another target, someone he could manipulate. But he had no idea who she really was. This story is about justice, power, and the ultimate price of racial prejudice in the system. It all started when Officer Johnson, in a fit of rage, slapped a woman in the courtroom. He had no idea that this wasn't just any woman, she was the judge. The courtroom gasped in shock. Johnson's face went pale as he realized his mistake. At first, he thought he could get away with it. After all, who would believe a black woman over a cop? But what Johnson didn't know was that this wasn't just a judge, she had the power to make his life unravel in ways he couldn't imagine. The clock started tick. As Officer Johnson tried to compose himself, he could feel the weight of his actions settling in. The judge stood tall, her calm demeanor hiding the fury beneath. She had been the target of racial injustice countless times before, but this was different. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was in control. Within moments, the courtroom erupted with whispers, and the judge's gaze never left Johnson's. In those few seconds, his world started to change. His once solid position as a respected officer. The judge didn't react immediately, but Johnson could feel the tension mounting. The silence was deafening. For a brief moment, it felt as though time had stopped. Johnson's mind raced, wondering what would happen next. But then, in a calm, steady voice, the judge spoke, "You've made a grave mistake today, Officer Johnson." Her words cut through the air like a blade. Everyone in the courtroom knew this wasn't just about the slap, it was about the abuse of power, the racial bias that had tainted tea. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom as she called for immediate action. Officer Johnson stood frozen, his mind struggling to grasp the magnitude of what he had just done. He had crossed a line, and now, there was no going back. What he didn't understand was that the judge wasn't just going to let this slide. She wasn't going to be intimidated or silenced by the badge he wore. The law, the very system he thought he could manipulate, was about to turn on him. His career, his life, every. The judge wasted no time. She called for an emergency session to address the incident. Word spread quickly, and soon, a crowd of officials, lawyers, and even reporters filled the courthouse. Officer Johnson, who had once walked with pride, now stood alone in the spotlight of his own downfall. He had been a part of the very system that perpetuated injustice, and now, that system was going to hold him accountable. As the judge gave her orders, Johnson's knees began to shake. His empire, the power. The media quickly caught wind of the shocking event. Headlines screamed about the cop who thought he could get away with it, but had no idea who he was dealing with. Johnson was no longer the confident officer he had once been. As the news of the courtroom altercation spread, his colleagues, the people who had once supported him, began to distance themselves. The badge that once gave him power was now a symbol of disgrace. He had underestimated the judge's resilience, and now, the consequences w. As the judge proceeded with her actions, she made it clear, this was not just about the slap. This was about the deep-rooted issues within the system, the racial bias that had been allowed to thrive for far too long. She was determined to make sure Johnson's actions did not go unnoticed. This was her chance to send a message, not only to him but to the entire system. Officer Johnson would soon realize that his actions had sparked a much larger movement. This wasn't just about one mistake, it was. Behind closed doors, a meeting was held. The judge, alongside her colleagues, discussed the next steps. Johnson's future was in their hands, but what they didn't know yet was how much the incident would shake up the system. The moment the judge made her decision, it would send ripples through law enforcement and the public alike. Meanwhile, Johnson sat alone in his office, staring at the walls that had once offered him comfort. Now, they felt like the walls of a prison. His empire was crumbling. The judge's decision was swift. She publicly addressed the incident, making it clear that Officer Johnson would face the full consequences of his actions. What started as a simple slap had now turned into a symbol of systemic abuse, and the courtroom stood still as her words resonated. Johnson's heart pounded as he realized the weight of her judgment. The judge wasn't just punishing him, she was dismantling the very system that had allowed his actions to go unchecked. His career, his reputation. As the news continued to spread, Johnson's colleagues began to speak out. Some supported him, but many turned their backs. The public reaction was divided. Some called for immediate action against Johnson, while others questioned the fairness of his punishment. But the judge's decision was final. The investigation into his actions would proceed, and his career was no longer in his control. For Johnson, the days that followed were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and legal battles. The once confident. The judge's actions had sparked something much bigger than anyone anticipated. What was initially a personal vendetta had become a rallying cry for those demanding accountability in law enforcement. The case became a symbol of the fight against racial injustice, and people from all walks of life rallied behind the judge's decision. Protests erupted in the streets, and social media was flooded with messages of support for the judge's bravery. Johnson, trapped in the eye of the storm, could only w. Behind the scenes, the legal process moved quickly. The investigation into Officer Johnson's actions was thorough, and it became clear that this wouldn't be a quick fix. Evidence of Johnson's racial bias began to surface, and the deeper the investigation went, the more his past actions came to light. His colleagues were interviewed, and many began to admit that they had known about his problematic behavior for years but had turned a blind eye. The weight of the investigation grew heavier by the. As the investigation continued, Johnson was suspended from active duty. The news was met with mixed emotions. Some celebrated the judge's swift action, while others questioned whether he was truly guilty. But one thing was clear: Officer Johnson's future in law enforcement was hanging by a thread. The judge's actions had sent a clear message, and Johnson was now the face of everything wrong with the system. With each passing day, the public's anger grew. The world had seen the injustice, and now, as the media frenzy continued, Johnson's every move was being watched. The once proud officer who had worn his uniform with confidence now found himself isolated, haunted by his own actions. His public support dwindled as more people began to call for justice. What he had thought was a momentary mistake had turned into a full-blown scandal. The judge, however, remained calm and resolute in her stance. She knew this was bigger than just one incident. It was about changing the way law enforcement. The investigation revealed disturbing patterns in Johnson's past. His history of racial profiling and aggressive behavior had been overlooked for years, but now the truth was coming to light. Former colleagues who had once defended him were now speaking out, exposing his prejudices. The case against him grew stronger with every new revelation. Johnson's defense seemed futile as more evidence pointed to his deep-seated bias. For the first time, he understood the full extent of his actions, and the public opinion was sharply divided. Some saw Johnson's downfall as a necessary step in holding corrupt officers accountable, while others believed he was being unfairly targeted. The judge, unwavering in her commitment to justice, continued to make it clear that this wasn't about personal revenge, it was about holding people in power responsible for their actions. As protests for police accountability grew, so did the calls for reform within the entire justice system. Johnson's case had sparked a. Amid the chaos, Johnson tried to regain control of his narrative. He hired a team of lawyers, hoping to salvage what remained of his career. But every move he made seemed to backfire. His reputation, once built on years of service, was now in tatters. The public was unforgiving, and with each passing day, the pressure mounted. Even his colleagues in law enforcement began to distance themselves, afraid of being associated with his actions. It became clear that Officer Johnson's place in the world. As the trial approached, the judge maintained a firm stance. She was determined to ensure that Johnson faced the consequences of his actions, not just for the slap, but for the systemic issues that allowed his behavior to persist. Her decision would not only impact Johnson but would also set a precedent for future cases. For the first time in his career, Johnson realized he wasn't just fighting for his job, he was fighting for his freedom. The stakes were higher than ever, and the walls around high. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial began. Officer Johnson, once a figure of authority, now sat quietly in the defendant's chair. His future was in the hands of the judge and the law, but what he didn't realize was that his fate had already been sealed by his own actions. The judge's words echoed in his mind, reminding him that this wasn't just about the slap. It was about a system that had turned a blind eye to his behavior for far too long. His time was running out, and he cowled. As the trial unfolded, more witnesses came forward to testify against Johnson. Each story added fuel to the fire, painting a picture of a man who had abused his power for years. The judge's decisions were clear and firm, and she wasn't swayed by the defense's attempts to downplay his actions. With each witness, the evidence against Johnson became undeniable. The courtroom, filled with tension, was a microcosm of the larger fight for justice that was taking place across the nation. As the trial progressed, the public's attention remained focused on Johnson's case. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, chanting for justice and reform. The pressure on the judge was immense, but she remained steadfast in her commitment to the truth. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The defendant, once so confident, now sat with his head bowed, realizing the gravity of what was at stake. The trial had become more than just about him, it was about a much. As the trial neared its conclusion, the judge made her final ruling. The room fell silent as she spoke, her voice calm but resolute. Johnson would face the full consequences of his actions. It wasn't just about his suspension, it was about his place in the law enforcement community, his reputation, and his future. The sentence would send a powerful message to law enforcement across the country. No longer would officers be able to hide behind their badges and escape accountability. The judge's deck. Johnson's downfall was swift and unforgiving. Once celebrated by his peers, now he was the face of everything wrong with the system. His career, shattered by his own arrogance, became a cautionary tale. The judge's ruling reverberated through the legal community, setting a precedent for how cases of racial injustice would be handled moving forward. Johnson, stripped of his position and his dignity, finally understood the true cost of his actions. It wasn't just his career that had collapsed, As Johnson's life spiraled downward, he tried to come to terms with the enormity of his actions. The weight of losing his career was nothing compared to the shame he now carried. The realization that his past decisions had hurt so many people became clear, and he had no one left to blame but himself. The judge, unwavering in her belief in justice, had held him accountable in a way that no one else had ever dared to. His life, once filled with certainty, was now uncertain, and the future seemed bleak. In the aftermath, Johnson found himself isolated. His friends, his colleagues, and even his family seemed to drift away as the full scope of his wrongdoing became public. The system he had once believed in, the same system he thought would protect him, had betrayed him. Now, he was left with the harsh reality that the justice he had once overlooked was coming back to haunt him. The public, once indifferent to his actions, had turned on him, demanding not only justice for the slap but for the The ripple effect of Johnson's fall from grace continued to spread throughout law enforcement. His case became a symbol of the urgent need for reform. In the months that followed, officers across the nation were scrutinized, their actions closely examined. Training programs on racial bias and the abuse of power were introduced, and for the first time in a long while, change seemed possible. The judge, who had sparked this transformation, continued to lead the charge, using her position to advocate. For Johnson, the months that followed were filled with reflection. He spent countless hours going over his actions, trying to understand where he had gone wrong. He had never truly seen the harm in his behavior, but now, the consequences were undeniable. As he watched the changes unfold in the justice system, he couldn't help but wonder if things could have been different. What if he had never let his biases influence his actions? What if he had truly understood the power of his uniform and used? The trial had ended, but the journey was far from over. Johnson's name had become synonymous with the need for reform, and he would forever be remembered as the man who sparked a national conversation about racism in law enforcement. The judge, however, continued to fight for justice, determined to make sure no one else would suffer as Johnson's victims had. In the end, it wasn't just about one officer's fall from grace, it was about changing the very system that allowed such abuse to thrive. And months later, the impact of the case was still being felt. The ripple effects were evident not only in law enforcement but in communities across the country. The judge's bold actions had ignited a wave of activism, pushing for widespread changes to address racial bias, inequality, and corruption. Johnson, now publicly disgraced, could only watch as the world moved forward without him. The one mistake he had made in that courtroom had not only cost him his career, but it had also ignited a revolution. As the dust settled, the legacy of this case was cemented. Officer Johnson's name became a symbol of what happens when power is abused, and the judge's name became synonymous with justice and reform. While Johnson had paid the price for his actions, the fight for racial equality continued. The judge's determination and the public's demand for accountability had set a new course, and though Johnson's career was over, the future had been shaped by the bravery of one woman who refused to be silent.